Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
One just anecdote about the train. So, of course, in California, we're still building a bullet train. Now, the first segment of it, I think originally was supposed to go from Modesto to Bakersfield. I have heard now that the first open segment will actually go from Modesto to pretty much nowhere. It won't even make it to Bakersfield. Or maybe Bakersfield won't make it to Modesto. I don't know. Who cares? But one of our supporters, who's an engineer, owns an engineering firm that he started with his brother out here in greater Los Angeles. He reported to me a couple weeks ago. He went to one of these kind of public, here's our update on the train, on the bullet train from a couple of reps and spokespeople for the whole project. And that's where he learned that. And he also learned that I think the person who's running the entire project has now, originally they had said, 2035, 20 blah, blah. Now we'll just not give a completion date to this whole thing. So it's going to make the big dig look like a bunch of pikers. I mean, it's got to be one of the largest money laundering and corrupt payout projects in the history of infrastructure. I think it'll probably take the cake over everything. It's really amazing. In a state the size of California, the idea that, especially with such spread out population, the idea that a bullet train would make sense, like until we invent nuclear powered maglevs or something, is just idiotic. It's so stupid.
Hello and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at the American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, features editor of the American Mind and associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books. I am joined this week by managing editor Seth Barron and publisher and president Ryan Williams, remarkably still standing and looking surprisingly alert on the Zoom call, despite especially alert now as he gives me a weird face over the Zoom to indicate that he is not going to be conquered by that newborn life. We are going to launch right into our new regular segment called This Is Fine, where we take a issue that is simmering in the background of a lot of things, a lot of the news stories that we typically talk about on this show. We figured it would be a good opportunity every now and then, or indeed even once a week, to pull back the camera and talk at a more holistic, you might even say structural level, about some of the things that are plaguing us. And this week, the impetus is a piece in the Washington Post, an opinion article entitled "Newsrooms That Move Beyond, quote, objectivity Can Build Trust." Objectivity in scare quotes. This is by Leonard Downey Jr., a former executive editor of the Washington Post and a professor at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University. So big experting going on here from this fella, and also somebody who's speaking, he speaks of that whereof he knows, because this is a guy who's been in a position of serious power in the media for some time. One of the things I find interesting, I have a lot of thoughts about this piece, but one of the things that I find really interesting about it is that it seems to articulate things that I feel like I've heard muttered or made reference to in lefty circles for a while. Slate, the lefty magazine, online magazine, has had this thing like objectivity is fake for some time, and they've been talking about, both sidesism, which is supposedly the error that journalists fall into when, out of a misplaced desire for objectivity, they have to attribute rationality and good faith to conservatives and right-wingers who really are just, purely arguing from venal, fascist, cynical motives. And this is kind of the argument that's on display here, or one of them. It's, with all these new issues coming to the fore, young editors and media critics, now I'm quoting, argue that the concept of journalistic objectivity is a distortion of reality, they point out that the standard was dictated over decades by male editors in predominantly white newsrooms and reinforce their own view of the world. They believe that pursuing objectivity can lead false balance or misleading both sidesism, there it is, in covering stories about race, the treatment of women, LGBTQ plus rights, income inequality, climate change, and many other subjects. We will get in a second to, I want to talk about the media generally, capital T, capital M, and the kind of state, the utter state of disarray in which I think we find ourselves when it comes to getting reliable information, the social media woes, the difficulty of trusting anybody, but certainly, the legacy press. But first, let me start actually by just asking you guys about this piece itself. I mean, this would be a shocking thing for a major, former editor to say, except that I don't even feel like it's saying the quiet part out loud anymore. At least since Trump, this has been a pretty explicit argument that, at least in covering the bad orange man, objectivity is kind of handicapped because we're so certain that he's an evil fascist that we need to cover the news with that in mind. Like, we need to kind of layer that perspective over whatever we say to begin with. But am I just like a jaundiced news junkie who's seen too much of this stuff? I mean, people are sharing this piece as if it's like, an admission of guilt, but I feel like this is like their governing philosophy now. No?
Yeah, I would agree. I'm not even sure what's newsworthy about this. It's just describing journalistic practice over the last 5 years.
Right.
Particularly.
Which is appalling, but yeah.
Oh, totally. I mean, it's absolutely appalling. But, I guess I just noticed in the last few years in particular, with coverage of Trump, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, all the major, they were just, they ceased having compunction about describing what he said as a lie. Like, traditionally you'd be like, the president claims that such and such and such, and then you would, whatever, debunk it or whatever in like the next paragraphs. But they just say, the president lied about the election, and they just say this over and over again, like, his repeated lies. I mean, if you're talking about something that's a very complex event, it seems weird to just, it's so simple-minded just to call what someone else said a lie. But this is what they do now. And I think they were even doing it after the Brazilian election, when, it seemed as though, like, believing in the probity of Brazilian elections was all of a sudden as important as believing that masks work and that, January 6th was an insurrection. They were even saying that some people were lying about the Brazilian election. It's like Stalinists complaining about like Trotskyite spiders, like creeping into every corner. And what is the alternative to both sidesism? Just one sidism?
Well, this is an interesting question because, like, there is a version of this argument that does obtain in certain other countries, like the British press, for instance. Like, you can make the case that, like, no human is capable of the kind of pure self-dissolution that has to happen for true journalistic objectivity. And, this notion that the journalist or the reporter just kind of vanishes into the background as just the facts come at you in an unfiltered barrage. Like, this is all fake, you might argue, and therefore it's better to have papers that avowedly come at the news from a perspective. You have your right-wing papers, you have your left-wing papers, you have your kind of like middle of the road or libertarian papers, but you don't have like this sort of fallacy of pure neutrality. So that's like a version of this argument that some of us even could like at least sympathize with, because, neutrality is fake is a thing that has recently been a popular meme on the right as well. This, Seth, you're right. Like, this is like a kind of pernicious or like sly perversion of that idea. It's like there is no such thing as objectivity. There's only the one set of opinions which counts as absolute truth. It's another way of, right, like excluding certain questions from reasonable political discourse. If it's not actually acceptable, or if it's irresponsible, even to entertain the possibility that Donald Trump might be telling the truth as he sees it, or presenting one view. And this extends now beyond Trump to anybody who supports Trump, and even people that just articulate certain views about whatever, gay people or what have you. Then it's like you just have to, what it really is just presenting the news as if the left-wing vision of the world were the facts of the case. And those are the things that no reasonable person could argue or disagree about.
Yeah, and the articles seem to me to be confused in a certain way about what it's talking about. It's not all bad either. At least some of the recommendations, which is to say, news organizations should be fairly nonpartisan. They should try not to, be mouthpieces for activists. Reporters should try to, be objective in that sense. But by objectivity, I think they mean something like neutrality, Spencer. But I think the whole thing makes a lot more sense when you consider it in a very postmodern way. The authors, of course, wouldn't admit such a thing, or maybe I don't even know if they think it, but I think the real backdrop to this paper, and it's illustrated in the kinds of questions they asked all a part of the pretext of the article is they did this big survey and got a grant for it. Their local, as you mentioned, at their local academic institutions. But the prejudice or the backdrop is revealed in the questions they ask, the responses they get from the types of editors, and the way they frame all of this in some of the opening paragraphs that you quoted about having diverse newsrooms and giving sufficient treatment to LGBTQ plus rights, et cetera, et cetera. And that the whole underlying premise is that there really isn't anything as such a thing as truth. So you can't really be objective about anything. It's more about the proper and politically correct balancing of narratives. And they don't talk about it this way in this piece, but that's what I see at work. Also, I thought also pretty interesting was the third paragraph where they sort of reminisce about that is the two authors. The one Leonard Downey Jr., the author of the piece, has a academic partner in his study, but he's writing, of course, in the first person. And he says something like this occurred, that is to say, the abandonment of pure objectivity and the embrace of something else. During my early years in the field in the 1960s and 70s, under the leadership of a few editors, including especially the Post's Ben Bradley, our generation of young journalists moved away from mostly unquestioning news coverage of institutional power. I was one of the editors on the Post Watergate story, which spawned widespread national investigative reporting that continues today. Colleagues at the Post, other newspapers, and broadcast networks reported skeptically on the unwinnable Vietnam War. I think this is a very revealing paragraph about where we are in modern journalism. Consider the two bookends to be, in a way, Nixon and Trump. And we've sort of brought this up before, but modern journalism, and I think the elite political class as a whole, tells themselves this fable about finally waking up to the perils of institutional power, maybe with Vietnam and LBJ, and then especially with Nixon and corruption and impeachment and Watergate. To hold that, I think from what we've learned about Watergate, some of us had inklings of the truth of it following, colleagues of ours like John Marini decades ago. But what we increasingly come to see is that the Watergate story, far from being an example of crusading journalists speaking truth to power, it was rather the paradigmatic example of what goes on in modern government, which is one part of the modern state, that is to say, the bureaucracy, the administrative state, and perhaps even the intelligence community part of it, or predominantly that, using the press as a weapon against Republicans in power. Mark Felt was deep throat. He was disgruntled that he'd been passed over by Nixon. He was probably alarmed, like the rest of the bureaucracy was, at Nixon's plans to go to war against the bureaucracy and try to reconstitutionalize it in his second term, or try to bring it to heel and allow his large constitutional coalition, and really one of the largest electoral coalitions in the history of certainly modern democracy in America, the largest, I think, Nixon's re-election landslide, and to wield that power and that mandate against a government out of control and a bureaucracy out of control. And so the bureaucracy took him out. that's a big part of the Watergate story that sort of never gets told except recently. And to come all the way back to Trump and the thing you brought up at the beginning, Spencer, which is, this article is kind of ho-hum to some of us, given what we've observed with journalistic standards in the age of during the Trump administration and after. This all is, none of this is news. But Trump, like Nixon, had sparked the ire of and panicked the permanent government, and they went after him with similar tactics. They don't work as well anymore because people know more, and the partisanship has sort of solidified on one side or the other of the permanent state, with Democrats in favor of it and Republicans, or some of them anyway, against, and some of their voters against. So I just found that paragraph very, very revealing. And then just one more, we can still talk about this, but I just wanted to put one footnote down too. Interestingly, a little later, so these two, this author of the article and his academic partner are studying all this stuff, and they're supposed to be the objective academics at this point. But I thought it's pretty revealing that he talked about American society itself has been in upheaval. This is on the second page of the piece, over the following things: discrimination against and the abuse of women, persistent racism and white nationalism, police brutality and killings, the treatment of LGBTQ plus people, income inequality and social problems, immigration and the treatment of immigrants, the causes and effects of climate change, voting rights and electoral inequality, and even the very survival of our democracy. Now, if you look at the top issues that concern voters ahead of the midterms, according to Pew Research, they are the following. I will read the top 15. You'll see a couple of overlaps here, but not much with that list that he listed. The top issues were the economy, the future of democracy. All right, that gets some of what he was talking about, maybe. Different meanings for Republicans and Democrats, of course. Education, healthcare, energy policy, violent crime, not necessarily police brutality and killings, policies about elections and voting, maybe, future of our democracy, gun policy, abortion, Supreme Court appointments, immigration, foreign policy, so immigration's 11, size and scope of federal government, climate change, there's one of his, explicitly, matches up perfectly. It's the 14th most important issue to voters ahead of the midterms, and then issues of race and ethnicity as number 15. So anyway, his list just shows what a lot of us talk about all the time, which is the built-in prejudices of the reportorial or journalistic class, which is itself a smaller piece of this larger class that are partisans of the way we do modern administrative government, the way we do bureaucratic government. It shows how wildly out of touch they are with the normal electorate. So this, too, inflects how they think about what is or what isn't nonpartisan reporting, what objective reporting could be, what neutrality should be. So there's a lot to unpack in this seemingly otherwise facile piece.
It's so rich.
It's larded with all this stuff, yeah.
Just the fact that he cites like one of the main issues is immigration and the treatment of immigrants.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The United States currently has like its highest percentage of foreign-born people, I think, in its history, or maybe it's at about the same level as like 1910.
Yeah.
Is there any question that immigrants are like systematically mistreated in the United States? Like, what are they talking about? Even illegal immigrants who are just coming over now are being well treated. I mean, it's not like this isn't Germany in like the 80s where you're seeing like houses with immigrants in it being burned down. I mean, it's just so crazy that they would put it in these terms.
But the whips, Seth, the whips that they use.
Oh yes, the whips. I forgot. No, it's hilarious when you see elite lists of national concerns versus like actual lists of national concerns. It always cracks me up. The other thing I just wanted to add is the self-congratulation. Now, this is some kind of like, I don't know when this guy, I mean, I guess if he was an editor 55 years ago, I mean, he's obviously not a young guy, but the self-congratulation about about opposing the Vietnam War from the Washington Post and the New York Times. I mean, the New York Times and the Washington Post didn't mention the 12-year buildup of troops in Vietnam, except as just like this natural kind of thing to do. The idea that, I mean, they basically turned against the Vietnam War after Wall Street did. Like at a certain point in like 68 or so after TED, it became clear, okay, this isn't working. That's when they started like fussing about it. They didn't care up till then. They didn't like push back on the Gulf of Tonkin, so it's just funny to see these old prejudice, these I guess I don't know if you call it a prejudice or just these just this self-congratulation about how obstreperous and oppositional the press has always been.
Yeah.
When
Well,
really, I mean, they're just it's like the poodle press.
Yeah. It's a series of fables, as I said at the beginning, that they tell themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they layer upon one another so that you can, once you've firmly established one fable, like the Brave Press, was practically in Vietnam, parachuting in with protest signs. Like once you've established that fable, then you can just reference it as if it's a kind of known fact. Same way you do with the whips at the border, which don't exist, right? Like you just sort of, the treatment of illegal immigrants, we know, as is known generally, right? There's a piece in the forthcoming CRB about this book, King Leopold's Ghost, which kind of established, set in the public mind and also in the academic mind, this notion that like there was this widespread abuse of Africans by European colonial powers in the Congo. And this guy just goes through the like open kind of falsehoods that this book indulges in, but it doesn't matter because it's just got this insane citation index. And this piece is full of that stuff. You're right. It is kind of a rich text in that way. Like there's a great moment where he introduces his academic survey project / grant bait, and he says, we interviewed more than 75 news leaders, journalists, and other experts in mainstream print, broadcast, and digital news media, many of whom also advocate for such a change, namely the kind of erasure of dispatching with objectivity. It's like, you got like, grant money to go talk to all your buddies that all think the same thing as you. Like it's kind of in a nutshell exactly the phenomenon we're talking about. But this thing about Watergate, Ryan, which is so well put, you adumbrated that really, really well. First of all, a footnote, there's a piece in First Things from a while back called Regime Change, American Style by our friend Chris Caldwell, a contributing editor to Claremont Review of Books. And if you want like chapter and verse on some of the stuff that Ryan is talking about, this is a great piece.
Yeah, basically now the new revisionist book on all this.
Yeah. Watergate, A New History.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's in First Things. I don't think it's paywalled. I'm looking at it now. I don't think that I'm behind their paywall. So that's a great piece for looking at it. But it's also a good way for us, I think, to kind of like enter into this bigger conversation, because Ryan has now sort of laid out, I think, the press's own self-narrativization, self-mythologizing. And so we know now, and more people are wise to the fact that this is like bunk, that like this thing about, the fourth estate and the watchdogs of democracy is like kind of all just confected as a mode of like self-aggrandizement. And digital conditions, as I'm sure James would say, were here, like digital conditions make this more transparent because we can see so much more behind the curtain. We can see like the guy who puts his COVID mask on to walk to the podium and then takes it off at the podium. We can see backstage as he does that. And so when the press then says like, masks are proven by experts to work, and it's like, we demand, objectivity must be put aside and we must insist that everybody like toe the COVID line. We can see them doing it in a helpful way. So that's like one sort of positive development. We've also got, the internet has created the ground upon which this kind of rebel press has come into being. You get these, sort of citizen journalists or people, lone wolves. I'm thinking of folks like Andy No and Mike Solana and like guys who are kind of institutions unto themselves. Chris Rufo, who do really go out and do reporting. The stuff the Daily Wire did with Loudoun County comes to mind as well. And so we did with Loudoun County. We sent Nate Hockman down there as well, as I recall. These people who, in any sane universe, I think would like have Pulitzers to their name, but who are out here doing yeoman's work, especially during the riots of 2020 and the COVID stuff. You got a lot of this. I'm probably leaving out a million people that I should be mentioning in this context, but it's just by way of gesturing to like, there is a citizen-free press now that uses the internet in these really interesting and innovative ways. At the same time, on the third hand, or whatever hand we're up to, you've got like I'm thinking especially here about the Twitter files, the openness now with which these arguments are made that you shouldn't like look at this stuff. You're bad for raising this. You're spreading disinformation for like looking into the way that the press just buried the Hunter Biden laptop story, and social media like totally prohibited people from sharing it in the lead up to an election. When Matt Taibbi and Barry Weiss and all these folks started like putting out information that Musk had been revealing, it was like Taibbi is Musk's lapdog. Like imagine shilling for a gajillionaire. You people in these positions of editorial power were saying this as if like they themselves had not fallen down what was supposed to be their job. So all of this simply by way of saying like, this seems to me like a crisis. Like this is obviously we know that our media is bad, but also just like the open kind of suppression efforts, the people who think they're the good guys trying to kind of run cover basically for the powerful. And also just the kind of disorientation that this, I imagine, produces in the average person who just logs on and is like, what am I doing? So maybe I just, let me start by asking you guys this, which is maybe like a simple question, but we'll get into it. Like, where do you go for your information now? You know, like if you want to know, like in a second, we're going to talk about Tyree Nichols and this really awful, police killing. And it's like, when this happened, I at least thought like, how do I sift through the narrative to the truth here? And like, there's some sources that I can trust, but I'm just wondering what you guys make of the kind of landscape, the media landscape now, and who you trust.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we've said this before, and it's just a sad state of affairs, but you must presume that the main organs of official narrative, that is the big newspapers, including the Wall Street Journal, I would add, unfortunately, especially its reporting, are, it's sort of a trust but verify, or actually distrust and then try to verify approach. Actually, Spencer, you mentioned the British press at the outset. It's the Daily Mail is one of the few places where you can get somewhat honest reporting about, especially race in America, and just like the events of it. They're not caught up in the pathologies of American mainstream narrative maintenance. And they're also, they're free from our history on race and slavery. And so they can be a little more objective, I suppose. Yeah. So, you just gotta go around. Look, I trust our friends on this type of stuff. I mean, our friend, I'm going to quote her in a little bit, but, my go-to person on a lot of this police racism and conduct stuff is our friend Heather McDonald, who... Oh,
I have her queued up to quote for the...
Yeah. So I won't steal your thunder. But, I mean, of course, the left would say this is absurd. Williams, obviously loves this terrible racist woman who works for the Manhattan Institute, Heather McDonald. First rely on your friends who, have integrity. And even if they're pushing a certain opinion, they're not just going to lie to you about the facts. Now, their interpretation may be inflected in some way. We just abandon the pretense. We should abandon the pretense that any news outfit of any sufficient size these days is doing anything other than grinding a few axes, some of which are favorite axes to grind. So with all that taken, you take it all with a grain of salt and sort of sift around and piece together the facts as you see them. Some of the local reporting is better. It's just, sticks to the facts, ma'am, more, or can. So whether you find it online or in print, increasingly online, very local stuff, and even some local news coverage would be. I mean, the local news is sort of connected to the big affiliates, so it's not that great. But yeah, the farther you can get away, either conceptually or ideologically, or just geographically from the big national news outlets, the better, it seems to me.
Yeah, it's funny how I guess it makes sense that local news is typically more trustworthy in a way. I mean, even down to like the level of like, the police blotter, and the national news is a lot less. And then, I mean, when it comes to something like Ukraine, Russia, I couldn't tell you right now whether Ukraine is on the verge of like total collapse or if Russia is about to fall. I have no idea.
Yeah.
I mean, I just have zero idea what's going on with that. But I sort of take the same strategy or similar strategy to Ryan. I mean, I see this kind of like you have to just triangulate. So, yeah, sometimes I'll start with like the Post or the Daily Mail and see what the more conventional sites say. I mean, it's kind of funny. Remember during under Trump, and the press kept making mistakes, but always in the same direction. So if someone's always saying if it's always saying the same thing, regardless of what the story is, well then, okay. So for instance, I know we're going to get into it, but what Heather has to say about this case in Memphis, or other people who I know who are strong advocates for the police, like if they all came out saying like the police were not at fault in this at all, well, then it would be like, why? Then they're just saying the same thing that they always say. So I guess, sort of seeing how likely a news source is to say something that you didn't expect makes me feel a little bit more confident about whether they can be trusted. And then to me, it's like a weird triangulation thing. And then going through Twitter and just seeing what makes sense, Unfortunately, I guess that's the glory of democracy. We don't have, there's no one place you can go to receive our truth. Everyone has to kind of come to it themselves.
Yeah, for all the sort of frantic scrambling to produce an official narrative, I mean, the more they try, basically, to install an official narrative on COVID that nobody can deviate from or whatever, the more apparent it becomes that no such official narrative exists. I really like that thing, Seth, about like the people who will say things you don't expect. Sometimes when I talk to people who do podcasts, they'll be like, yeah, the thing that really gets audience is if you don't know what the person is going to say next. It's very, very hard either to be that person or to find that person. But yeah, that's a good metric as well.
Yeah, and a variation on that is keeping an eye out for admissions against interest. This is an old sort of legal term, right? A good example now is there's this. I will just flag it for people because it's interesting. Jeff Girth in the Columbia Journalism Review. There's a 4-part thing on journalism's terrible handling of Russia and Trump. Now, this is typical, right? So it's an admission against interest now because it goes into some detail about how the press really failed in that they just swallowed whole, again, like Watergate, but even more explicitly, a basically confection of the security state in league with one of the two parties against the other party. This whole fabrication. So that's an admission against interest because it's his profession. But there are still a few people of integrity, on the left in these institutions. Mr. Girth seems to be one, so now he's laying it all out. But I should note, it's maddening and frustrating because, of course, now it doesn't matter. The stakes are so much lower. The damage is already done. A president was very likely denied re-election, partly because of years and years of lies about this and many other things. Look an eye out for admissions against interest. I think both right and left are always interesting, and it's just another way of saying what Seth did, which is when you see unexpected lines of argument from places, it's usually a nice thing to keep an eye out for.
Yeah, I'll add just one other thing to this. I think these are actually really good rubrics, and I hope that our listeners find them helpful insofar as they are wondering about these same questions. I will add something that I should have said when I was talking about the British press, which is like the next thing you say after you say, well, there's no such thing as objectivity, neutrality is fake, whatever. So you need to have all these different kinds of papers. The point of that is like, so then at least if you have multiple different, biased news sources, you know what you're getting. You're getting the conservative paper or the lefty paper. To my eyes, a lot of those papers, in point of fact, in the UK have drifted leftward generally. So you have just kind of like left and leftier. But in the abstract, at least, like approaching the good version of the neutrality is fake argument, even if you don't want to buy it altogether. I mean, I still believe in some version of actually presenting the facts in an objective, or at least visibly, transparently sourced way. But if you want to say neutrality is fake, then like you can then go and say, okay, so what is the viewpoint of this paper? That's what I'm getting out of this source. And now I'm going to go hold it up against something else. And as we've been suggesting, this is a great way into talking about this awful Tyree Nichols story. I guess Ryan has mentioned it and I have mentioned it, so I will just begin with Heather McDonald's description of what happened here. because it's really, well articulated and does not, you think Heather McDonald, you think, defender of the cops, and often rightly, very regularly with great sources and statistics to back up her claims. And she does not defend the cops here. She says 5 Memphis officers responded to what was initially reported as a car driving the wrong way down a street. The officers' tactics during the stop of the driver, Tyre Nichols, captured on video, were an abomination. While shouting contradictory commands, the officers immediately escalated their use of force without apparent cause. It was Nichols who tried to de-escalate the chaos, a responsibility usually put on officers, not on suspects. The cops struggled without coordination to cuff him while delivering gratuitous kicks, punches to the face, and baton strikes. None of the officers' actions conform to police training. Virtually everything on view in the videos violates sound stop and arrest techniques. Nichols repeatedly collapsed and received only belated and listless medical attention at the scene. 3 days later, he died in the hospital. So, it's hard to watch this stuff. It's difficult even to talk about it, especially because it then immediately gets subsumed, as this did, into a genuinely, I think, pernicious and stupid narrativization of what is effectively human evil. I mean, this is like a terrible thing that was done by people, 5 cops, who abused their power. There is no utopian version of how you're going to fix this problem and eliminate it from human society forever. There's never going to be no episodes like this. You can have a serious conversation about how to reduce the number of episodes like this, or how to train people better, or whatever. But of course, that's not what we're doing. Instead, as McDonald points out, what we seem to have done is embarked upon a conversation about whether Black cops can be racist against Black suspects, because every event of this kind is now immediately a referendum on quote unquote systemic racism. And it was Van Jones of CNN, at CNN, who wrote most directly, it's the race of the victim who is brutalized, not the race of the violent cop, that is most relevant in determining whether racial bias is a factor in police violence. So the systemic racism of our society has already informed, you've seen this argument elsewhere too, has already informed these people's views of Black perps and Black suspects, even though they themselves are Black. I am not sure. I mean, there's something very postmodernist about this, to be standing in the wake of this man's murder, killing, and arguing over whether the abstract forces of racism, the kind of Geist of racism moving throughout capital H history, has animated, taken over the bodies of these police officers, deprived them of all agency and responsibility, and it animated them like a kind of spirit to do this thing. I'm not sure what really to make of it. I'm interested to hear what if you guys think there's anything more to be said here other than just how do you even engage with with an assessment of just human tragedy that boils it down to this absolutely cockamamie and totalizing narrative about race in America.
Well, you know what? I think that it's actually, I think Van Jones kind of has a point. And when we talk about Black people who are killed by the police, I don't think we can just out of hand dismiss the idea that the race of the victim makes a difference. But then that's why you apply statistical analysis. And when you do that, you see, oh, well, actually, Black people are not disproportionately killed by the police. Once you factor in whether they were armed, what their behavior was, and also just the high rate of criminality in the Black community, which, winds up, causing proportionally more interactions between Black people and the police. Not that all Black people are criminals, but there is a higher rate. So, I guess, look, would it be impossible to say that if it had been a white guy, these 5 Black cops might not have just it reminds me, there's this great line in Last Exit to Brooklyn by Hubert Selby Jr. It's one of my favorite novels, where he says, they hit him until their arms got tired, which just seemed like just such a a rich line of like, just like, just brutality, and like it only stops once the brutalizer is tired. And that's what these guys reminded me of. Just like, punching him, just whatever the hell they wanted. Would they maybe have held off if it was a white guy? I don't know. See, that's the problem. There's not. We would need more like test cases. So I wouldn't say that Van Jones is completely off base. And we do have this piece. Well, we might be running a piece by Jason Hill, a black philosophy professor who argues very strongly that this, it just reflects a kind of like moral degeneracy among like, these cops and so forth. I don't know. I mean, maybe there could be a certain degree of self-hatred, racial self-hatred that they're expressing. I don't know. I don't think it's really like, I think to say that they were enacting white supremacy doesn't really make any sense, though.
Yeah, well, Heather points out that, the modern academic left-wing definition of racism is prejudice plus power. So when you put that up, it's easier to see how these cops, like Larry Elder, were the black face of white supremacy. They're in a normal setting. If they weren't cops, they wouldn't have power. But they've been plugged into this institutional power system created by whites for whites, and so this is how the narrative goes. And so we shouldn't be surprised that they, I guess, act white in beating down this black guy to death, something along those lines. I thought, interestingly, I just like Heather because she is completely fearless and will just day after day, week after week, will point out the unsayable in modern life about all this stuff. And, she doesn't offer any proof, but there's some circumstantial evidence that this relentless pursuit of diversity, including in police departments, has led to the lowering of standards. It has to, given the statistics about competence, criminality, etc., amongst populations. So if you want more black officers past a certain point, you have to start lowering standards, because blacks who would apply, the black population in general has a higher rate of misdemeanors and other criminal convictions. And so at a certain point, your labor pool runs out in this profession like policing, where they don't allow that sort of thing. So just a few lines from Heather scattered across a few paragraphs towards the end of the piece. For decades, police departments have gone through waves of aggressive diversity hiring, accomplished by lowering educational standards and by discarding the expectation of a clean criminal record. A typical 2017 study showed that increasing the number of black officers on a force increases police killings of blacks. Now, the left might read that and say, look, that you pour a lot of black officers into this corrupt system, and then more blacks are killed. This is the sort of machine of white supremacy. Or because your relentless pursuit of diversity means you have to lower standards, and ipso facto admitting more black officers beyond a certain point means you have to lower standards, you're going to have more incompetent officers, and that's going to result in more abuse, corruption, and death, unfortunately. And the Memphis link is, this is my last line from Heather, even before the post-Floyd racism panic, the Memphis Police Department led the state of Tennessee in requests for waivers to hire officers with felony and misdemeanor convictions as a response to manpower shortages. So that's a piece of this puzzle that, of course, no respectable, quote-unquote respectable journalist or mainstream media outlet would tell, as always with this sort of thing, we're kind of in the grip of a racial panic. It's maybe the temperature's a little lower than 2020 and the post-George Floyd freak out, but it's still simmering there. And the left has every reason, and journalism as a whole is kind of more left of center than not, and they have every reason to read all these facts a certain way. And so it's just perfectly predictable that we get, at the far left end of maybe Van Jones parroting some academic views about race, racism, and systemic racism and policing, all the way to just the president of the United States, Biden, using it as another occasion to talk about, the exhaustion, I forget how he put it, but the exhaustion of brown and black America at this, at the fact of life that whenever they walk out of their house, that they're at higher risk somehow. So everyone's playing their part, as you would expect. And unfortunately, we're getting really no closer to frankly dealing with any of these problems. The core piece of which is that roughly, depending on how you count and separate the sexes, somewhere between 10 and 15% of the population commits 60% of the violent crime in America. And it's one demographic. And, until we can talk honestly about that and why that is, which we have not been able to of late, this type of thing will keep happening. Well, it's a big country. This type of thing will always keep happening, but our explanation for it will get, I think, throw up. We'll throw off more heat than light for the foreseeable future. And people, I'll point people to, in my piece where I talked about what must be done, which Spencer nicely praised last week, I cited Charles Murray in the Claremont Review Books, the last issue, where he reviews a book about immigration. It was about immigration, right, Spencer?
It's Yasha Monk's book.
Yeah, immigrants, assimilation,
diversity in democracy.
Yeah, diversity in democracy, right. Exploring this topic that, Robert Putnam brought up reluctantly after sitting on it for 10 years, that in his social science research, this was in his book of 5 years ago, maybe, the more you increase diversity, the more you decrease social trust. And so Yasha Monk is sort of examining all this. And Charles Murray points to a couple of big holes in Monk's book. And Charles gets at some of these questions, which have been the topic of a lot of his research in recent decades, which is, differences among groups and what that means for public policy, if we can put it as benignly as possible. And
risking a sorry, go ahead.
No, and this Memphis thing is just and the police question in general is a microcosm of that larger question, which we can't answer honestly right now in America.
Risking a Claremont Institute Ouroboros collapsing us into the singularity. I'm gonna plug the other the CRB podcast, our other podcast, which has its own feed. It's called The Close Read, and we're gonna have Charles Murray on to discuss that review because I think it's really good and raises some very clearly, directly, simply raises these big blind spots in Monk's thesis. One of which has to do with social trust and the erosion of it.
Yeah,
which again, it's like, as Murray I think would probably be the first to say, it's not like this is something to be glad about. Nobody is celebrating the fact that actually forming a diverse democracy is really hard for all these reasons. It's just like to talk about the subject without even acknowledging that this is, now manifestly true, known to be true by way of decades worth of research is like kind of irresponsible. And I think maybe that's
I just the way I put it in my piece is it's the convergence of long held common sense views of normal Americans going back all the way to the founding, and even before the founding, just normal people, common sense converging with social science, which is to say, you can't have a discrete political community like a nation or a city-state or whatever and think you can preserve it while also pursuing infinite heterogeneity of new people. It's just it's just common sense.
Yeah. I don't know why I keep quoting Thomas Jefferson on this podcast because he's probably like my least favorite founder. Like I'm an Adams guy rather than a Jefferson guy, although they're all great. But Jefferson does in his notes on the state of Virginia have this little thought experiment where he's like, what if you just picked up, I think it's the population of Paris and you dropped them into America. Like there's nothing wrong with Paris particularly. It's just that the kind of customs and the mores and the just habitual small c constitution ways of life would instantly be at odds, would cause all these problems and would disorient both the native population and the transplant. So these are all like obvious common sense things to say that suddenly make you sound like racist. While
we're on a tour of anecdotes from founders, I've been struck because I'm reading, I was sort of perusing, our dearly departed friend Pat Garrity worked on this huge sort of reference volume of John Quincy Adams on everything under the sun called A Nation United and Independent. Just go to Amazon and find it. And our friend Ben Judge finished it up. Pat died, unfortunately, before the book was quite finished. But John Quincy Adams is just an early example of, the differences of culture and conduct. He went when he was like 13, maybe. He might have been 11. Went with his father, maybe even 13. It doesn't matter. Anyway, went with his father they were going over to Europe because John Adams spent a lot of time on various ambassadorial assignments in the early Republic and even the early constitutional period. And they're traveling through Spain, and John Quincy is appalled, at And one of his great observations was, I saw a lot of fat priests and a lot of skinny people. And he was also appalled that across Spain, they went overland across Spain because of bad weather, and they regretted it because they spent 2 weeks on the ground in Spain. And even compared to colonial America, which was certainly not Versailles, France, the Spanish were living in hovels with dirt floors, the animals sleeping in, not really much of a roof, no real beds to speak, from John Quincy's perspective. It was like traveling back in time to some backward Catholic, misery dome. With
bad priests, skinny people is such a like classic Enlightenment line. It's like right out of Voltaire.
Yeah. So fat, corrupt clergy and a bunch of poverty, and it was shocking to a young John Quincy Adams. So the power of culture and habit and political structure on offer right there.
Yep.
Sounds like some classic anti-Romish propaganda there.
That's right. Anti-popery. It's propaganda. That's
right. This is a
I'm just thinking about some of our what do you call it? Integralist listeners.
Some of our RC friends, as Mike.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I know. This is like a kind of a prot heavy show, I guess. Although James is Eastern Orthodox, so that's not quite. I don't think that counts as Protestantism.
That's true. Yeah, James.
It's like OG Protestantism.
James is the only Eastern Orthodox Claremonster. Proud.
Yeah. But we've got a pretty religiously diverse crew, despite not having any Catholics now that Matt is out. We've got the Jewish guy and Seth. We've got 2 Episcopalians, right, Ryan? Basically.
Sorry to confess, given the state of the modern Episcopalian Church, yes.
Yeah, exactly. It's a shameful card, but we carry it with a certain degree of resignation. And then there's an Eastern Orthodox in James, so RCs, we love you, even though it's a podcast. Let us transition now to the part of the show where we talk about our favorite pieces from the site this week. I got a little vote of confidence from our friend Auguste Mayrat, who said that he endorses my kind of provisional name for this segment, although he kind of cleaned it up a little bit. I think I said something like, read our damn website, you schmucks, or something. But he says just call it Read the Damn Site, which I kind of like. So from now on, unless anybody has a better idea, this segment is called Read the Damn Site.
Good.
And I will go first. You should read the damn piece on the damn site called The Great Train Robbery, which is going to be part of a feature we've got going on about transit. It's by Joel Kotkin, and it's I've described it as Kotkin contra train maxers. He kind of just lays out this, trend among public works types to pour money into not just building trains, but nudging people onto trains, and using his sort of rich store of data and data analysis. Joel just illuminates why this will literally never work. It's an exercise in futility, and he kind of outlines a very sensible alternative project. Easter egg in the piece: when I first received this in draft form, Joel talks about the San Francisco being a leader in CBD, and it took me a while to figure out that he wasn't talking about pot. So you can go read the piece to find out what he actually is talking about. I spelled out the acronym for you. It's called The Great Train Robbery by Joel Kotkin.
Yeah, thanks, Spencer. One just anecdote about the train. So, of course, in California, we're still building a bullet train. Now, the first segment of it, I think originally was supposed to go from Modesto to Bakersfield. I have heard now that the first open segment will actually go from Modesto to pretty much nowhere. It won't even make it to Bakersfield, or maybe Bakersfield won't make it to Modesto. I don't know. Who cares? But one of our supporters, who's an engineer, owns an engineering firm that he started with his brother out here in Greater Los Angeles. He reported to me a couple weeks ago. He went to one of these kind of public, here's our update on the train, on the bullet train, from a couple of reps and spokespeople for the whole project. And that's where he learned that. And he also learned that I think the person who's running the entire project has now, originally they'd said, 2035, 20 blah, blah. Now we'll just not give a completion date to this whole thing. So it's going to make the big dig look like a bunch of pikers. I mean, it's got to be one of the largest money laundering and corrupt pay out projects in the history of infrastructure. I think it'll probably take the cake over everything. It's really amazing. In a state the size of California, the idea that, especially with such spread out population, the idea that a bullet train would make sense, like until we invent nuclear powered maglevs or something, is just idiotic. It's so stupid. And yet it's going.
You got to respect the grift, though.
No, the grift is strong. I mean, a lot of the players who envisioned this from the beginning are getting exactly what they wanted, which is they're making them and themselves and their friends rich. It's sort of an eternal jobs program. So anyway, that's my update from California. I wanted to highlight Carson Holloway's piece, Libel and Cancel Culture. The subhead illustrates it for you. The Supreme Court needs to revisit its flawed ruling in New York Times versus Sullivan. I encourage you to also go to dc.claremont.org and look for Carson's Provocation, which is these little pamphlets we put out on this same topic. Carson has also done at least one piece for, I think, Law and Liberty and maybe another site. This is a hot topic on the right, including a certain large state governor who's talking to Carson about this, I think, this week. It's very interesting. For those that don't know, New York Times versus Sullivan was this Supreme Court precedent that basically exempted a good portion of the press from libel and defamation suits. Not really exempted, but raised the bar quite high, almost impossibly high, in bringing suits, especially from politicians. So, and this is the reason it's getting a lot of attention now is because with the rise of fake news and a lot of just unquestioned and really breathtaking slanders and defamatory statements against politicians with the attempt to destroy their reputations and prevent their reelection. It's a lot of people are thinking it's time to revisit this precedent. And as candidate Trump said, what did he say? Loosen up the libel laws a little bit, which of course scandalized everyone back in 2015 and 2016. So anyway, read Carson Holloway, even if you disagree with him. It's a very interesting topic, and it's one of these things that we kind of take for granted as being a rock solid piece of our political and media culture, but it's not, should not be an ironclad principle, and perhaps some middle ground between maybe an over litigious common law standard like in Great Britain on these questions and the somewhat absolute indemnity. It's not even the right word. The absolute prohibition or near absolute prohibition on the success of any of these suits against journalists in the United States. We maybe could find some middle ground and improve our national discourse and public policy in the meantime. So go read Carson.
Yeah, I like both of those pieces. I would say that everyone should go read The Biden Autocracy by Kenan Spivak, which we posted last Friday. It's a pretty good piece. I mean, it's not breaking any new ground. However, there is a tendency to, get a little swallowed up with all of the, all of the good feelings press that the president gets, and the sense that, he might not be the best president, but he's not Trump, and he's just doing what he does. But Kenan very carefully goes through all the different ways in which the Biden administration has just overstepped constitutional norms and really shred the Constitution in so many ways, and just the rule of law to, enact its agenda. Looking at the January, the January 6th prosecutions, the prosecutions of that anti-abortion protester who was fortunately acquitted yesterday. The payouts, the money that's been paid out. It's a very interesting DEI stuff. It's a very interesting piece, the American Rescue Plan. So I would recommend that everyone take a look at The Biden Autocracy just to satisfy yourselves that it really is as bad as you might have thought.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to get desensitized to that stuff, which is obviously part of the point. It gets normalized, if you will, and it shouldn't be. So that's a great piece for kind of reanimating a little bit of your righteous ire. And with that, I will tell you once again to go read the damn site. And I will thank you for listening to the damn podcast. Thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. I could very easily overdo this. In fact, I think I maybe already have. But
shut this damn podcast down.
Shut this damn podcast down. It's over. It's over for everybody. Yes, thank you for listening to The Roundtable. If you would like to learn more about all of our projects, you can visit our many websites. I feel like every week we have a new website for me to tell you about, but that's not quite true. You can go to AmericanMind.org, ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com, Claremont.org, and you can visit our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. You can donate to help support the show at claremont.org/donate. We will shout out to you if you do, so you'll have the thrill of hearing your name spoken aloud on this here hallowed cast. Or if you, wish to remain, I was going to say, if you wish to remain anonymous, you will have the thrill of having your sued respected. We are sued respecters by and large here on this show. And in any case, what I'm trying to say is donate to support the show at claremont.org/donate. And rate, review, share, and subscribe wherever you get your podcast, especially, or maybe even only, if you have positive things to say. 5-star reviews are really helpful, especially on Apple Podcasts, to help people find the show and get the word out. That's it for this week. Thank you to our production crew, Jake Gannon and Logan Zeppieri, and we will talk to you all next week.